Tonight we're going to go on an adventure into the twilight zone of the Ten Commandments. Maybe the most important and least understood biblical text in history. Before I do that, I want to thank our sponsors, Tribe Media, Jewish Journal, and Hillside Memorial. And I want to just say that we have a challenge tonight because we have 3,000 years of debate and contemplation and history that I have the privilege of trying to summarize into 30 minutes. But I'm not going to be alone. I have a lot of help. And I want to introduce our panel tonight. I'm going to start with my friend David Hazony, who is the author of the Ten Commandments. Well, not God. He wrote a book on the Ten Commandments.
I get that all the time.
And I will say a few words about him. David, he's written about religion and politics in publications like the New Republic, Commentary, and Jerusalem Post. He's the former editor of my favorite Jewish journal. Well, not Jewish journal. That's, yeah, second favorite, Azure. It's a terrific journal that he edited for many years. And he studied rabbinic thought and biblical thought in Orthodox seminaries in the U.S. and Israel. He's currently pursuing a doctorate in Jewish philosophy at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And his book is outside. If you like what he says, please buy his book. We also have my friend Carol Bakhos from UCLA, assistant professor of Near Eastern languages and culture. At UCLA, trained at Harvard Divinity School and the Jewish Theological Seminary. In addition to many scholarly articles, she's the author of Ishmael on the Border, Rabbinic Portrayals of the First Arab, editor of several books, including Judaism in its Hellenistic context, current trends in the study of Midrash, and the most recently published co-edited work, The Talmud in its Iranian Context. In 2009, she served as acting director of the UCLA Center for Jewish Studies, and this semester she is the Rabbi Sally Present Scholar at HUC. And then finally, Rabbi David Woznica. We here in Los Angeles stole him from New York City 7 years ago. New York City, where he was the founding director of the 92nd Street Y, which became a national hub for Judaism and won national acclaim. He's now the rabbi at Stephen Wise Temple, where he has to deal with 3,000 Jewish families with very high standards. He's an old pro at this stuff. He's been on many panels over the years with some of the great thinkers in the Jewish world today. So our format, you know, I figured we've had thousands and thousands of years on the Ten Commandments. The least we can do is spend a few minutes on each one. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to spend 5 minutes on each commandment, which should take us to 50 minutes. After that, we're going to have a general discussion with the panel on the broader issues, on the relevancy of the Ten Commandments. And then after that, we're going to open it up to the audience for my favorite section where you get to make all your speeches about Israel. All right. So we start with the first commandment. Who knows the first commandment? All right. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. This, the first commandment that deals with monotheism. So I will ask David Hazony one question on this one that always intrigued me, which is, what if you don't believe in God? Does the whole thing fall apart?
No. Next
Thank
question.
God. Okay, good. Very good. All right.
The book that I've written is starts with the assumption that each of the Ten Commandments represents a bigger ideal, some kind of high idea that if you take all 10 of these ideas, then you have a vision and a recipe for a good society, for what the Bible intended that we should be striving for. And the first commandment is no exception. Excuse me. First of all, there are 1,000 different ways that God could have introduced himself to the Israelite people at that particular moment. They've come out of Egypt, they've gone up to the mountain, they've seen the plagues and the miracles, and if you were the editor, if you were God's editor, at that moment, you would say to him, listen, you have to choose your words very carefully as to how you're going to introduce yourself. He could have said, I am the Lord your God who created the heavens and the earth. That's probably the most obvious one if we're starting from first principles. He could have said, as he said to Moses, he could have said, I am the Lord your God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But he chose to focus, or the author, however you want to look at it, chose to focus on taking the Israelites out of Egypt as the most important thing you need to know about him at this moment.
Okay, but I'm still struggling with this idea of belief in God. Rabbi Woznica, you know, Maimonides made a big deal about this. His interpretation was that, in fact, there is sort of an implied commandment here to believe in God. What's your take on that?
There's always been a debate, David, whether the first commandment commands belief or not. I think it's a more important. The question, I would rephrase it. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. By the way, when I was a rabbinic student, I had a chance to teach 8th graders, the only time I ever taught 8th graders in my life. And if you want to know how Hebrew school has changed, since you were in 8th grade, one of the kids said, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Bondage, cool. So things have changed a lot since we've been in school. Now, I think what God is saying, I'm going to pick up on what David said, is God is making a statement, I act in history. I did something for you, therefore I need you to do something for me. I think this entire first commandment is an explanation of the covenantal relationship between God and the Jewish people, that it isn't just a God who creates the world and lets go. This is a God who said, I did something, but I need you. I need you to carry a set of values, a set of ideals. Indeed, I need you to live by all the following commandments to be an exemplar, an or lagoyim, a light unto the nations of the world. So whether or not you believe in God is quite secondary to whether or not you act as if you believe in God.
In a way, it's like God saying, you owe me.
Yes,
Yeah,
I believe
but
that.
I have a question for the both of you.
Wait a minute. There's
Yeah,
only one
no,
moderator
sorry, I
on this
can't
panel
resist.
here,
I
Carol.
cannot resist.
Okay.
Well, because I'm struck by your focusing, and rightly so, on the fact that God identifies God's self as having taken the Israelites out of bondage. But that assumes, and then you mentioned the covenantal relationship with the Israelites, that assumes then what follows are commandments that are for the Israelites. Do you believe that the 10 Commandments are only for the Israelites?
Yes and no.
Okay.
If you have a child that you're walking across the street, and you say to that child, you better look before you cross that street, then is that a universal or a particular commandment? Okay, it is it's both. It's the context of the 10 Commandments is definitely the context of the covenantal relationship. But it doesn't mean that the commandments don't have universal implications. But when you're reading it, and you're reading it in the sort of first-person plural, we, the descendants of the Israelites, are reading this text and are asking about to understand the covenant, then I think that it's both. But if I could just finish the other point very quickly, I don't read this as the deal as I took you out of Egypt, now you better do what I say. I think the key word in the first commandment is you were. I am the Lord your God. Having a God, it doesn't just mean worship, it doesn't just mean obeying, it also means imitation. There's an assumption here that if God took the people out of Israel, then the meaning of the first commandment is that you too should see yourselves as the kinds of people who ideally can be taking people out of Egypt, out of bondage, intervening in history.
Well, I would agree with that. No, go ahead, Carol.
No, I just want to point out that for general information, that you stated that the first covenant is the first commandment is I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. According to the Catholic and Lutheran division of the 10 Commandments, it is I am the Lord your God, and you shall have no other gods before me. So I mean, it is we need to know that
first two, and then they split the last.
That's
last one,
right. They do.
Got it. So we're going to come back to it, I'm sure. The second commandment, you shall have no other God but me. I want to start with you, Rabbi Woznica. the traditional interpretation of this commandment is against idolatry. And I've heard all the metaphors for idolatry. You know, the idea that, you know, you get too materialistic, that's a form of idolatry. And what's your take on that? I mean, are we all idolaters in a way?
I think the intent was to separate us from those who worshipped other gods. Who was it? Was it Buber who said everybody worships God? It's just that some people worship God with a capital G and some worship God with a small g. So when God, remember the rest of the commandment includes not to make a graven image, et cetera, et cetera. So clearly one of the ramifications of this commandment, as I understand it, David, is that we are not to make a physical image of God. Monotheism, I think, is at the basis of this. So we believe in one God, a God who has a set of values and ethics, and to paraphrase what David just said earlier, God gives us certain abilities. He's our God, and we can try to emulate God. But I think the question for us becomes is, what are the graven images we worship today? And they aren't necessarily the obvious ones like money, etc. Anything that takes the place of God and ethics usurps this commandment. Anything. It can be the state, it can be another human being. In other words, I understand this commandment to say there is one God, God's central demand is ethics, and anything that we don't observe around that is to worship a graven image.
Well, let me give you a tough one, all right, that I read recently, where nationalism could be seen as a form of idolatry.
Certainly the state can be.
So if your state asks you to do something evil, while God asks you to do something good, and if you follow what the state does rather than what God tells you, then that's a form of idolatry.
Well, you now understand why the Soviets and all communists are at loggerheads with Judaism. Because for Judaism, God is the ultimate authority, and for communists, the state is the ultimate authority.
Right, but don't we have a vexing problem here? I don't want to bring in politics, but I will.
Of course.
You know, where you have to, you know, if you're a religious settler in the West Bank and the army sort of gives you an instruction that you think goes against God, doesn't that, David Hazony, you live in Israel, do you actually experience this dilemma? What do the rabbis say about this? Is it considered idolatry to follow the IDF rather than what you think God says to do?
Well, probably, but a lot of the rabbis, including the most extreme of the settlers, they don't say that. They actually, if the state says, for example, to withdraw from Gaza, if it goes against their understanding of what God teaches, they don't necessarily worship the state. And the IDF, on the other side, has a very strong principle that that if you're given an order that is what we call, in Hebrew, it's bilti chuki ba'alil. If it's extremely illegal order, then you're obligated to disobey that, which is unusual.
Right.
Yeah, just a point. The second commandment, I'm not sure reflects monotheism, but rather henotheism, which is that God demands our allegiance, but it recognizes that there are other gods. So there are other gods in this matrix, right? It isn't saying that I am the only God. I'm the one that you shall have no others but me. You shall have no others but me assumes that there are others.
Well, only in the sense that imitation mayonnaise is a form of mayonnaise.
Well, I mean, there are, but we know that there were other gods. I mean, God destroys Leviathan, and who is among you? Who is like you among the celestials? There is an assumption that in the Hebrew Bible that there are these other gods.
Well, maybe that's where free will comes in.
Well, I mean, I do differ with you on this. I do think that that there's a subsuming. I mean, throughout the Bible, there's a sense of these other gods. What you see as other gods are, in some fundamental sense, false. Either because the celestial beings, where they may be in some sense angelic, but they're all the creation of God. What I do want to say, though, is that I agree that my gut is that it's not about monotheism, for one simple reason. The epitome of idolatry is the golden calf, and there's only one golden calf, which suggests that it isn't about the number so much as how different the golden calf is from God. God is in some sense invisible and a creator, and the golden calf is visible and created. And so I would sort of try to push it in a direction of, but I want to, if I could just ask Carol, let's say you're right. What's the implication about it for the meaning of idolatry? What does it suggest that is, because the big question is what's wrong with idolatry? What's so bad about it?
Well, as you had said early on, the Hebrew Bible is about this unique relationship between God and God's chosen people. So it's about it's about that relationship. So what's wrong with the other? There are one aspect that's problematic is the betrayal. God chose from Abraham on, and so the idol worship is a form of betrayal, not just there is this one God.
There's a sense of humanity to what you're saying in God. I mean, in a way, he's
God's
like
a jealous God, right?
He's
God
recognizing the
wants God's
competition.
people. Yeah.
He's recognizing competition.
Yeah.
But with Carol is saying is that he demands loyalty, though. That loyalty becomes very, very fundamental to
right. But there's also an insecurity in a way, because if he really was sort of, then he wouldn't be so insecure as to say you better not go to anyone else. But there's some humanity there that I think you brought up that I've never heard before on this particular one. So I think that's interesting. Rabbi Woznica, we're good? Okay. All right. Where were we?
Why are we doing only 10 and not 613 at this rate?
We are. I just didn't want to tell the audience.
We have all night.
Well, yeah, we have till 10, right?
We're finished. Yeah, we're here until tomorrow. Number 3, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Carol, I'm going to start with you on that one.
Oh, God damn it. Oh, no, sorry.
Yeah, I mean,
forgive me.
Has this been trivialized? You always hear, like Jiminy Wicket, what is it called? Yeah, instead of Jesus, I mean, in sort of your world. In my, in the Orthodox world, God forbid, you should write God with an O. Most Orthodox Jews, they just put a dash. I mean, it's gotten almost a little silly.
Well, some would even say, and I'm not arguing this, but I have heard it said that even referring to God as Hashem is a bit problematic. But I don't want to go there. But
okay.
This is what I was told. I'm reminded, again, going back to the idea of loyalty and betrayal. Taking God's name in vain is taking that relationship lightly. And there's something, actually David mentions this about dignity, the dignity of the self, that's part of this commandment. I'm thinking of Jephthah and Jephthah's daughter and the rash oath that Jephthah makes, and that we have to be people of our word. So that's how I see taking the command against taking the name of God in vain, not to in a sense take take our word as bond.
Meaning it's about false oaths,
yes,
not so
yes,
much
yes.
just sort of saying the name of the
Yes, that's right.
I think this is a life-changing commandment. And what you didn't quote was the entire commandment. It's Lo Tisa et Shem Adonai, do not carry God's name in vain, because if you do, Lo Yinakeh, God will not clear anyone. Right. It is the only of the 10 that is unforgivable. Think about that for a minute. It must mean something absolutely extraordinary if God will not forgive us for that commandment. And I, as a kid, grew up hearing that it was cursing God, which I don't think we should do, by the way. I do think I think that does not elevate God when we curse God. Having said that, I do not believe that what this commandment means. When does a Jew carry God? If I walk down the street wearing a kippah, if people know in my office building that I take off for the Jewish holidays, they know that I'm carrying God's name. I am seen as a religious Jew. I don't mean Orthodox. One is seen as a religious Jew, and therefore you represent more than yourself. How you act, therefore, affects not only people's opinion of you, but the opinion of the Jewish people. And if people who are thought of as religious act in ways which lower God, they haven't just lowered Judaism, they've lowered God instead. Let me give you an example. Order a kosher meal on an airplane when they used to serve kosher meals. Everybody around you, they used to hear over the loudspeaker, you know, will passengers Cohen, Rabinowitz, and Schwartz press their, stewardess, now flight attendant call button. Everybody comes around you. People want to know, we have your special meal for you. You got your special meal. Everybody on that plane knew that I was Jewish, whether I wanted them to or not. How I then acted to the flight attendant was a reflection of what people would think of the Jewish people. This has a lot to do with what it means to be a religious Jew. Not where we use God's name, but understanding that we represent more than ourselves. So when a Jew goes out of his or her way and does something beautiful for humanity, we have done a Kiddush Hashem, we have elevated God. When we do something that we have shamed us and the Jewish people, we have lowered ourselves. Therefore, taking this commandment seriously means every time you do something in public and people know you're Jewish, means you represent more than yourself. And one last comment, which is why I think it's life-changing. I wish every group in the world felt that way. Every minority should feel that way. We don't just represent ourselves individually. We are part of a people and therefore have a greater sense of responsibility.
I've heard it said that it's the most important commandment in Judaism, the idea of honoring God's name. So
I have a question on that. Doesn't that open the door for a certain kind of hypocrisy? That if you are, every human being really is different and unique. And if you're walking down the street, I don't know if you've attempted this experiment, but if you...
We don't walk in Los Angeles. So when I was in New York, I walked occasionally.
Yes, I actually was thinking about New York.
Right, Jerusalem.
Let's assume that you're going up 6th Avenue,
right,
and you're almost at Central Park, and you take your kippah off.
Right.
Okay. On the one hand, you can say, I'm no longer representing God, but in a certain sense, doesn't that free you to represent yourself in as accurate and honest a way as possible, so you don't have to go around, in a certain sense, pretending to be some kind of angelic, religious, virtuous being that you're not?
It's a very fair question, so I'll answer it in the best way that I think that I can, and that is, along with the privilege of living a committed Jewish life comes some responsibility of living a Jewish life. I can't tell someone whether or not to. By the way, the reason I didn't just use kippah because, you don't have to wear kippah to be thought of as religious. You just have to be thought of by other people as a committed Jew. So I'll let the individual choose, but every privilege has a concomitant responsibility.
But the repercussions are just, astounding, because how often do we see, representatives of Judaism with the black hat doing things that could be construed as desecrating God's name? Isn't this a real problem in Israel, David? Isn't this a constant sinning of desecrating of God's name?
Think that
do they realize they do it?
But this doubles back to my question to Rabbi Woznica. If an ordinary secular Israeli refuses to stand up for, to give his seat on a train to an elderly person, no, it is a problem. Right. It's a problem, and he will be told off for it.
Not in terms of this commandment.
Hang on, he'll be told off for it. If the same person happens to be wearing a black hat, then the response will be a lot more visceral, because there'll be a sense of, you are a hypocrite. Right. You there with your black hat and your righteousness and everything like that.
No, but that underscores the point, if I may. That means we have higher expectation of religious people. Thank God. Right. Thank God. The minute we lower our expectation of religious, it bothers you much more to learn what the priest did than an average Catholic, and you should be bothered more because they represent more than just. They represent the church. So I think what you just said, if anything, if I may, I think underscores the point. We have expectations, and I want people to know, that there's a sweet story. Forgive me because I know you want to limit it, but there's a story of a young man in the Talmud, and his buddies decide it's time for him to have his first physical experience. So they take him to a house of prostitution. And he goes up to the room, and he's with this woman for the first time, and she disrobes, and he begins to disrobe, And the Talmud says his tzitzis, you know, his talis, his tzitzis flew up and slapped him about the face. Whereupon he said, a good Jewish boy shouldn't be in this situation. He starts to get dressed. She then says to him, what's wrong? Don't you find me attractive? And the story ends with, he starts to tell her about the tzitzit, about Judaism. She converts to get married and live happily ever after. So a friend of mine said, so the moral of the story is if you're going to a house of ill repute, leave your tzitzis at home. I don't think that's the idea. But the idea is by wearing tzitzis, he should be reminded to live a life. I don't wear tzitzit. I don't say that out of any
If I just one quick, I love what you're saying, and I find it very important and inspiring. It troubles me at the same time very deeply to always. I'm concerned about the fact that religion in general is seen as simplistic, is seen as insensitive to the nuance of human realities, and creates expectations among people who represent religion that are very often destined to fail. And the result is that when you have all these scandals, in fact, religion in our world is despised by people who have powerful moral senses of their own, and might even have powerful Jewish moral instincts that they've carried with them all their lives. And because of what they perceive as hypocrisy, they say, I'd rather have these moral instincts than parade myself as a rabbi. And so I'm kind of torn on this very issue. I find it, on the one hand, you're right, and on the other hand, but what about all those very sensitive human beings who've given up on religion precisely because of this disparity between the perfection that is often presumed to associate being a rabbi with the realities?
Perfection is not we're in the wrong religious group. Perfection is not the goal. Coming a little closer to being better is, I think, the goal here. So I think there's great sensitivity. I think the sensitivity is simply that we're striving to become better human beings, and the more religious we are, hopefully, the more we can become. So when a religious person does something that is clearly immoral, it hurts not only that person, but all of religion. And therefore, I think we do have to be sensitive. I don't think the goal, what's that line, the best is the enemy of the better? Perfect is the enemy of the good, same idea, So I would say, I don't think there's a disagreement here. I think the issue is that this goes far beyond, and this is what you were saying, Professor, simply using God's name in a curse. But if we take it seriously, it has tremendous implications.
I knew this Chabad rabbi in Santa Monica, and I was with him on Shabbat, and he lived with us for like 3 years, so we'd often go to Santa Monica Promenade and stuff like that, and I would often see him on the street. And he was a fanatic about always giving to the homeless. And he told me once the number one reason he did it was because it's Kiddush Hashem. He represents God, and that's the statement I'm making. So we're up to number 4. All right. Remember the Sabbath day to make it holy. Who's going to start with that one? David?
Okay. The fourth commandment, of course, teaches us that we should keep the Sabbath because God created the universe in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And that creates a little bit of a problem because the Torah doesn't tell us why God rested. And it's a little odd when you think about it because he's God, right? My approach, and it's actually a crucial question because if you don't answer that, if you don't know why God rested, you can't know why we're supposed to rest. The fourth commandment is one of only 3 places where we're told explicitly to follow God's example. And the other 2 are like these general statements. So you have to know why God rested if you're going to be able to keep the Sabbath in a full way. So what I suggest is that, and I'll just keep it really brief, is that if the creation story had been only the first 6 days, and there hadn't been a 7th day, you would have had a God who was completely and totally identified with his work, with his creative action, that God is creativity and creation and doing and always doing things. And by resting on the 7th day, he essentially created himself as separate from everything else. And the implication therefore is that that's also what we're supposed to do on the Sabbath. We're supposed to cut ourselves off, not just rest physically, but cut ourselves off from our creation, from our creative activities, and to create a day in which we exist separately when we create ourselves.
Rabbi Woznica?
Amen to everything you said. And I wish that Shabbat was taught in a more meaningful way. Because when I was a kid in Hebrew school, I learned it something like this. Okay, class, today we're going to learn about the fourth commandment, the Sabbath. On the Sabbath, we don't go to sin, we don't drive, we don't use the telephone, we don't watch television. Shabbat shalom. I would have rather been comatose, because most people think that the purpose is not to rest. The purpose is to make one day of the week holy. What does holy mean? I like the term holy means to raise from the mundane, the everyday, to the godlike. What does God do that's different all the other days of the week? God stops creating. Therefore, we're supposed to stop creating on Shabbat. Has nothing to do with work. What's more work? Walking 5 miles or driving 5 miles in the snow? The reason some Jews don't drive their cars has to do with the fact that when you start your car, you've created a spark. My dad owned the gas station. I know from carburetors. They don't make carburetors anymore. Anyway, that's another story. In any event, when you start your car, you've created a spark. And creating a spark is a violation. Creating a fire is a violation of Jewish law. By the way, the one example where this doesn't hold, the one exception to the rule, is procreation, where couples are supposed to be active or sexually active. A 1-minute story. In 1988, I was a rabbinic student, and I was invited to go up north to the Catskills to give Catskill Mountains to speak to 250 single men and women. I mentioned Friday night that it's a mitzvah to have sex on Shabbat. I didn't think of anything else. The next morning, I go up for the second talk. Everybody is smiling. This is the happiest group in the world. I said, why are you all so happy? He says, David, something you said last night. What did you say last night? That it's a mitzvah to have sex on Shabbat. I said, did I not mention that's only in the context of marriage? I hadn't mentioned that. And I go, there goes my entire rabbinic career.
They all became Shomer Shabbat that night.
Yeah, it was a very Shabbostic idea.
Carol?
Just an observation. So when God finished creating, he saw what he had created, and it was very good, and then he rested. And I think there's a connection there that perhaps also being holy, setting apart, is the Shabbat is a time to recognize all that is very good in our ordinary lives. So it's that stepping back that God, the act that God performed is stepping back and looking and saying it is very good that we take with us into Shabbos.
Right. But somehow, I mean, we're idealizing in a certain sense here, but you know, the reality is 90% of Jews will not do the Shabbat, and even among the other 10% that I often see in Pico Robertson, I don't see much holiness either. So what's been missing, David? I mean, you know, we live in a world where productivity and creativity is king. So if I hear that during 6 days God creates the world and then he rests, I'm wondering, why does he need to rest? He's God.
Let's see what it doesn't say.
Why does God need to rest?
Let's see what it doesn't say. It doesn't say he worked 6 days, took the second half of Friday off, started cooking, okay, and then went to shul a lot, where he fell asleep over a good book. Okay, that's what it doesn't say. Shabbat in modern traditional or Orthodox life, which is what I know most directly, is for many people a burden.
Is it the fault of the Talmudic rabbis? I mean, you know, they'll have 6 pages on how to squeeze the lemon on Shabbat, and you know, whether you're allowed to, you know, do this sort of sponge and so forth. I mean, it's become so legalistic that that has taken away some of the holiness of Shabbat, Carol?
I wanted to address it. Yeah, I was thinking of, I'm still on your other question. What's missing? And I immediately think, it's not a question of what's missing, it's what's too much there. I'm reminded of Wordsworth's, the world is too much with us. And this idea that, I mean, it's really hard to get unplugged. So it's not what's missing, it's that we're too much there, and we need to extricate ourselves.
Can you turn off your BlackBerry for a whole day? That's the question. That's the real question here. Can you do that?
David, you hit on something I think important. Any beautiful ideal can be destroyed if it's over-legalized. I'm a Reform rabbi. I respect Orthodoxy tremendously. But if I felt something, one chumrah after another, was becoming so oppressive, I would not look forward to it. So this is my attitude, and if this is helpful to anybody here, for yourselves or your children or your grandchildren, a little bit is better than nothing. If you can do 25 hours of Shabbat and you define that as you want, I think, God bless you, that's beautiful. But if you make Shabbat on Friday night and you make a Shabbat dinner and then you go to a movie, it's not the ideal, but it's better than not making a Shabbat dinner at all. You want to create a memory for your children or your grandchildren, bring them close to you on a Friday night. Put your hands on their head and say a blessing. That is a memory that will last forever. Tell them you love them. Tell you, if you know the blessing in Hebrew, fine, or in English, simply say to them what a privilege it is to be your father or your mother. You will create a memory that lasts forever, and if you want to have a sense of how powerful that memory could be, ask yourself, if you didn't have that memory, would you like to have the memory of your mother or your father every Friday night putting their hands on your head and saying a blessing? That to me is Shabbat.
Leads very well into the next commandment, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I read a paragraph in your book, David, that sort of caught my eye. It was in Shabbat chapter, and I'd like to read it for you. Nowhere is this more obvious than in sexuality. Sex is the source of so much conflict and inner turmoil, largely because we are so vulnerable to the distorting questions of selflessness and selfishness. Naked before another, dependent on another's affection, we must overcome so many barriers, past traumas and guilt, questions of giving and receiving, and our self-worth. One person may worry that she is giving too much, but then, awash in self-loathing, worries that maybe she has no right to the selfishness that receiving entails. Another is selfish as a child, seeking only his own gratification and ignoring the reality of another. Where do you get this from the fourth commandment?
It flows
It's a
directly.
beautiful paragraph. It's beautiful. I know it's on selflessness and
Well, right.
selfishness.
So as soon as you establish that the Sabbath is about creating the self, then you get a whole big, huge question of, isn't selfishness bad? And so I had to contrast the biblical idea, which I believe in which the self, we expand and deepen ourselves so that we may give to others, and that these don't contradict each other. And I contrasted that with perhaps one of the classic views in Christianity, which is the idea of that we give to others not as an expansion, but as a sort of form of self-denial. We turn ourselves into a vessel through which the grace of God can come down, and it's not us. And but and this is one of the reasons why the Hebrew Bible, for example, affirms mutual affection, affirms sexuality, because it is a form of giving to another and receiving at the same time, and these combine into a single form kind of unification.
There's a very active dynamic in the way we're talking about Shabbat here that I think is really salient. Which brings us to commandment, everybody's favorite. Honor your father and your mother. Well, the first obvious thought is if your parent is abusive, how do you honor an abusive parent? Who wants that one?
You decide.
Rabbi Woznica, what does honoring mean?
That's, I think, the most important question. And it's interesting that it doesn't say love your father and your mother,
Right.
because Judaism very, very rarely commands emotion, because you can't command emotion. You can't tell people how to feel. You can only tell them what to do. So I think what it's saying here is that with the understanding that every relationship with a mother, with a parent, there are times of great love and times when there's not love. And I dare say everyone in the most loving relationship has had times where you don't feel love. So the key is, how do you show them honor when you're not always feeling a sense of love? And there the Talmud is actually very specific about a child's responsibility to his parents. Right. I think it's the end of Tractate Kiddushin, about not sitting at their table, observing yahrzeit, et cetera, et cetera. In terms of an abusive parent, I have two thoughts on that. The first is, if it's serious, Judaism, like America, doesn't make laws for the exception. You make laws for the norm. Unless, God forbid, you were really seriously abused by, if you were seriously abused by your parents, obviously you don't observe such a law. You run away from such parents. Serious abuse. But if you have all 10 fingers and all 10 toes, anybody knows what it's like to raise children, okay? So we do our children a disservice when all too often they're being told, and modern psychologists occasionally do this, that the greatest problem in your life is your parents. We owe our parents big time. And while they don't always have to know every element of our lives, to give them a call once a week, more often if you have a loving relationship is terrific. The very abusive parent, clearly not. But I think the key here is why our tradition with this extraordinary insight is saying, don't force people to love, but you know how to show them honor.
Yeah, I think that one of the most important words you used was very. Because I would say that the number of people who are deeply hurt by their parents, are conflicted about their parents, that's a much greater number. And a lot of people find themselves at a certain point in life where they discover their parents' humanity and their weakness.
Yes.
And they go into a certain kind of a crisis. And I'm not talking about the very abusive. I'm talking about many ordinary failings or extraordinary failings. Many hurtful things happen. But I think that what the most important thing to know here is that for those people, honoring your parents is crucial. And it's crucial not just because of what they've given you in a sense of gratitude, but because of who they are inside of you, right? We are, whether we like it or not, we spend our whole lives either imitating or consciously rejecting or in dialogue with what our parents did or did not do. And after that crisis point, a lot of people who, if they work hard enough at it, maybe 20 years later, they get to a point where they learn how to accept and love.
Completely agree with you. And keep in mind, how your children see you speak to your parents is how you can expect them to speak to you.
Carol, what's the Christian take on this commandment? Because I know Jesus said some not so nice things.
About his mother.
Or hating your parents and so forth to follow me and stuff. I mean, that was in the very beginning in Matthew. Eventually...
Right. In the Gospels, there is a moment when God, when Jesus says to...
I forgive
you.
I think you just violated like 6 of the commandments right there, Carol.
I don't forgive you.
I'm just here for comic relief. I think that what Jesus, there were those who wanted to follow him, and there was an episode where he does require those people to leave their parents and follow him. I don't think it was negative toward parents in general, but that your commitment to following him had to supersede the familial bonds.
This is not just a Christian problem. When I was a rabbinical student, there was a rabbi with a very long beard. And he was giving a lecture to all the students about their careers, and he really wanted them to become rabbis. And a lot of them had parents that weren't really thrilled about this idea for a whole bunch of entirely reasonable reasons. At a certain point, he says, you want your parents tell you, your mother tells you not to become a rabbi, and you have all of this Torah here and all this holiness. Let me ask you something. If your mother told you not to wear underwear, would you listen to her? And he thought he just had the greatest argument in the world. And the problem is that when any ideology will teach you to ignore your parents, because your parents give you a certain kind of a wisdom that's very instinctive and that you can't find in any book. And when they tell you, there might be good reasons not to become a rabbi, no offense to any rabbis in the audience, there might be some wisdom there. There might be something powerful and important that they're trying to pass down to you. And I noticed the fact that, as far as I was aware, there were no mothers telling their kids not to wear underwear.
But, there's a rupture that's required. Because, the Torah wants you to become one flesh with your spouse. That necessitates a type of rupture that needs to happen. That's why I love what you said on the difference between honor and love. That, you can honor and still become one flesh with someone else. But the love is more difficult to create a rupture
I also
from.
think there's an important distinction to be made between liking your parents and loving them, and I think it's the same with children. Dare I say, I can imagine that parents love their children, but unconditionally, but don't always like them. So I think that's something to keep in mind as well.
What I find remarkable about so many of these commandments is how little we follow them. That somehow something fell off, because the way we talk about them sounds so beautiful. But then we go back into the real world, and I see friends of mine, the way they talk about their mother or their father, it's just often embarrassing. We get caught up in these sort of daily issues, and we just forget the honor. So now we're up to number 6. You shall not murder. I think another problem I found with the 10 Commandments is there's sort of the duh factor, which is like no kidding. And there's a perception of, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't kill, and so forth. And this one in particular feels so obvious that what can this teach us? Who wants to take this? Carol? What can we learn from something?
You're killing me. You're killing me.
It's not murder. No, but what can we learn from a commandment that on the surface sounds so obvious? David?
Well, the value of life, on one basic level, that life is valued at all costs. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus says that it says you shall not murder, but he gets to the root of what would motivate one to murder, which is anger. And he says, the law says do not murder, but I say to you, do not be angry at anyone, because it is the anger that leads to the murder. Right? Do not seek vengeance. Do not be angry at another. Get to the root of the problem. And he also says in the commandment says, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, if you look at a woman lustfully, better you pluck the eye out, right? Remove the desire that would lead you to sin. So do not murder. It is actually it's not saying, it's saying do not, but it's also saying it's also exhorting us to value life. Right? To preserve life.
It's interesting because, they're not commandments, they're utterances, right? But they're written like commandments. So it doesn't say value life. It says do not murder. Thou shalt not murder. David?
Well, first of all, years ago I was doing a dialogue with a very, very thoughtful theologian, Christian theologian, and he said, similar to me, Carol, to what you said, about, if you have adultery in your heart, it is as if you committed the act. So my reaction to that is then go ahead and commit the act, because you're going to get in trouble anyway. You might as well enjoy it along the way. I would gently challenge your premise that it's a duh. In other words, lo tirtzach, you shall not murder. Murder is the most natural inclination that a human being can have. You're firing me, I'm going to kill you. Okay? You're hurting me, I'm going to kill you. And by the way, it's instructive to note that lo tirtzach does not mean you shall not kill. As you correctly said, as you shall not murder. There is a time when killing is actually mandated in Judaism, a famous Talmudic teaching that if someone's going to kill you, get up earlier and kill them first. Isn't that amazing? Pacifism, not objecting to a particular war, pacifism, to say violence is ipso facto evil, is my understanding a little outside the bounds of Judaism. So what I'm going to suggest is we have become so westernized that not to murder is duh, of course you don't murder. But it's not. That's what people did, and frankly, travel around much of the world today and see what happens to people for stealing a loaf of bread, or for being accused of molesting, or in parts of the Arab world for being raped. Being the victim of a rape, you can be stoned to death. So it's hardly duh. I would say quite the opposite. We should be mindful of how absolutely and utterly revolutionary these values were, and they are continuing to be in the rest of the world.
Now,
I wanna
Christianity, the
also-
King James Bible, did not actually call it murder, correct? It was still do not kill
That,
in the
yeah,
King James.
right.
Is that problematic, Carol?
Is it problematic?
That they didn't call it murder, which means basically there is never a justification for killing, even in self-defense, or when it is.
Well, in my,
Justified.
I killing murder for me is the same, even though obviously they're different. And the King James is based on the Jerome, the Vulgate, and I think in fact even the it's still do not kill. Are you asking me? Are we justified in ever killing?
It just seems to me, based on the King James Bible, that there is never a justification.
Well, but
for
it's interesting
killing.
that you're taking the Ten Commandments in this canonical, more fundamentalist manner, that they're not interpreted. Of course, they're interpreted commandments that, and there are distinctions made in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam with respect to when is it acceptable
Right.
to kill.
It's an acceptable sin.
Well, the
Yeah.
minute you ask that question, it's acceptable at times. Murder is killing of the innocent. Killing of the innocent is precisely what we're not supposed to do. But that doesn't mean we can't defend ourselves, that we can't kill at times. There is moral killing and immoral killing. Immoral killing is murder.
I want to go back to the question about the duh factor.
Yeah.
And my response is a little less gentle, perhaps, than the rabbis. I think that as soon as you phrase it the way that Carol did, that it's about affirming the value of life, you become sensitized to what are the things that devalue life. You become sensitive to the fact that there are cultures in this world today that devalue life in comparison to other cultures.
Right.
And anybody who's been following the news out of Israel the last few days knows this very, very...
Right.
I'm referring, of course, to just this horrific terror attack that took place
Right. It's
the
just
other day.
it's the first one that brings us down to secular law. Up until now, the commandments, there's been a certain nobility that goes way beyond legal issues. It's, the believe in one God, the absence of idolatry, and honoring the parents and so forth. There's a nobility. Then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, that one I can get it from, Superior Court in Hill Street in LA. So I think that's where the dove factor is introduced within the flow of the Ten Commandments. And speaking of, are we ready to go on to the next one? All right, good. Everybody's favorite. You shall not commit adultery. Yeah, they almost took it off and they kept it in. It's complicated. All right. You shall not commit adultery. Let's see. First of all, I have a problem that it's only based only on a woman's status. There's a certain discrimination against women here that's always bothered me. And I don't know who wants to take this one.
I'll take it
But,
if you want.
Go ahead.
I don't think it's any secret that in the ancient world, women were considered property. Okay, and I think that if we're going to read the Ten Commandments in a way that translates them into something relevant for our world, then we need to do that translation work. Okay, when you also have coveting in the 10th commandment, it includes your neighbor's wife. Okay, it doesn't say anything about your neighbor's husband. The assumption was that, and the reality also was that women, by and large, were not literate. So any text was written for a male reader. So you take these two things and combine them, and it shouldn't surprise us so much that the original phrasing of adultery, in a technical legal sense, was referring to the woman is a married woman, and you're taking some other guy's wife, which in the book of Proverbs is described not only as a sin against God, but as a really stupid thing to do, because then the guy's going to come and kill you.
But since women are not property anymore,
But since
isn't this?
okay,
Are there rabbis that are sort of evolving this and saying that adultery should be considered both ways?
Absolutely. First of all,
Which ones?
in the medieval times, the rabbis banned taking more than one wife. okay, which was a
That never got to Morocco, by the way. Yeah. It was known in our tradition. You know, it stopped with my grandfather.
Is it something you want to tell us?
No. It was known. You got the tzaddikim, you know, Baba Saleh and 5 wives. And
So the point is, though, that over time, as within the rabbinic tradition, it became more and more clear that women were not property. Then I think the fundamental meanings of the 7th commandment also evolve, and the 10th commandment also evolve, and that this is one of the examples also where it's so crucial not just to read the 10 commandments as a strict halachic legal text, because it becomes a lot less interesting that way, and in some cases it becomes antiquated.
So
go ahead.
So the do not, as I said before, the do not murder is reminds us, exhorts us to value life. So too, do not commit adultery is telling us that we must honor our relationship, our intimate relationship, right? Do not betray the relationship. God, in the first commandment, the first, second commandment, however you divvy them up, wants complete allegiance. And so too here we are called to value that relationship and to honor the other person. And here, I think I actually understand do not commit adultery not only in terms of do not have sexual relations with another. I actually would put under that rubric having an intimate relationship with another that is such that we no longer focus on that unique relationship we have with our partner. It is a form of adultery. I may not legally be, but I believe that when one strays and finds an intimate, you may not have sexual relations with the person of the opposite sex, but that person becomes your confidant and takes the role of your spouse. That is a form. That's a transgression. So maybe they should just go ahead and do it and enjoy it. Going back to your other comment.
I think I would gently take issue with you on that last part. If we can't make a distinction between emotional intimacy and sexual intimacy, I think we're misunderstanding the commandment. Maybe one should be careful not to be overly emotionally
You're playing
intimate.
with fire.
You may be, and that's fine, but that's not the same as crossing the line and having physical relations. And I think that there may be reasons, I'm not disagreeing, to watch one's intimacy with a member of the opposite sex.
Online, by the way, you see this all the time. People become
Right.
obsessed with someone online, and their primary relationship is jeopardized.
Well, it may be jeopardized, but it's not adultery until they do something. And I think that we need to be, it's very, very important, I think. And I'm not suggesting we have those relations. I think you're right in the sense that anytime we have very intimate relationships with members of the opposite sex, there's a sexual tension that can occur and might lead to something. And therefore, that is why we should be very, very careful. I do not think that's adultery.
Well, but if you take my premise that adultery is the betrayal
Yeah, I
of
don't.
that relationship,
But it's a physical betrayal. I mean,
it's a sexual and a sexual intimate and
wait,
and that's
so have they been sexual or not?
But sexual isn't necessarily
Sensual.
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 Sensual is one.
Sensual.
Okay, I forgive me, I may be old-fashioned here.
Sensual.
I think,
And I may be a prude. I don't know.
no. I
Can
think that the tradition, I think that adultery was meant physical relationship.
Well,
Can
if I
just
could,
can I just
Yeah.
intervene here? I think it's fascinating how you guys have really become Talmudic rabbis before our very eyes.
I didn't even use my thumb yet.
we're just getting started.
well, David,
But
can I
if
put a
you-
plug on your book?
What?
I have to
Okay.
put a plug on your book.
For that, I will defer.
Absolutely. I think one of the things you'll love about the book is exactly what you're seeing right now. There's a sense of empowerment, of taking these 10 commandments and looking them almost as 10 invitations, 10 doors that you can open up and create a sense of personal meaning. And I think this is one of the things that can make the 10 Commandments more relevant. That if you, Carol, sort of interpret this in a certain, very modest way, then that can create your own relationship with these 10 Commandments. And I think if there's ever going to be a return to relevance, then that has to be sort of part of the picture. And, I like to sort of, jump from just murder and stealing and stuff. Like we were talking about murder before, and you and I were talking the other day, that you can kill a kid with what you say to them. You can kill them, like in 10 seconds. You can say something to a kid that will be a type of murder in a certain sense, right? So that's sort of a personal, adding personal meaning to that.
I think the rabbis of the Talmud liken certain words to murder. They have certain elements of Lashon Hara.
If you humiliate somebody in public.
Humiliate somebody in public, it's
exactly.
likened to murder.
Exactly,
However, most of us would rather have a loved one humiliated in public than murdered, and that's what I think. Most of us would rather
I would rather have my spouse have his fling thing once than have an intimate emotional connection with another person. That's far more threatening than the fling thing. But
it's good to know.
Yeah.
David.
Duly
Yes.
noted.
No, I was to try again to intervene.
Yeah, go ahead.
What?
You don't feel you're getting time here?
No.
Yeah,
The time isn't the issue.
You don't have to plug your book.
Time isn't the issue. The issue to me is, are we focusing on the delineation? I understand that the delineation, the differences between you isn't simply a technical one of where to draw the line. That where to draw the line argument reflects something more profound. What I'm interested in exploring these commandments is an analysis that's similar to what Carol said about murder. Not murdering is affirming a specific value. And for me, the value that is affirmed in the seventh commandment is not simply preserving or loyalty or keeping a relationship. There's an affirmative value of love and of a certain kind of love that is, I think, presented in the Bible as the ultimate purpose of marriage. The thing that marriage is protecting is a certain kind of an ideal relationship. And we discover throughout the Bible that wherever you have a case of romantic love, one of the things you notice throughout the Bible, wherever there's romantic love, there are impressive children.
King David.
Okay, King David and Bathsheba, they bring us Solomon. And Ruth and Boaz bring us David and impressive by the standards of the Bible itself. Within the narrative, okay, we're supposed to be impressed by Joseph, who's the product of Jacob and Rachel. Okay, every time you have powerful love described, the Bible then goes on to affirm strongly the children that are the product of that relationship.
But that's illicit romance. Isn't there a place for
it was more illicit
holy?
than David and Bathsheba.
But isn't there a place for holy romance? Does romance have to be illicit for it to be romance? I love your point. I love the whole idea of taking each commandment and taking a flip side, sort of a more positive view of it, and to look at, do not commit adultery as a celebration of romance, which can often be lost in the staleness of a marriage. I think that's pretty innovative. And I know that's what you wrote about in your book, Dave, but it doesn't have to be illicit, though.
No, it doesn't have to. Jacob and Rachel aren't illicit.
Right.
Absolutely not. The point is more to say you can't talk about marriage. Excuse me. You can't talk about marriage without talking about the purpose of marriage.
Well, you can't talk about adultery, you mean, without...
Well, you can't talk about adultery as a violation of marriage, okay, unless you have some kind of an ideal about what marriage is supposed to be. I understand it's a little bit of a several-step process here, but I think that without it, we end up talking much more about marriage than about love, and then you that's also a certain kind of a problem on the opposite side.
Okay, we're going to move on to number 8. You shall not steal. Now, in the Talmud, they speak, mostly of kidnapping, right? It's as if material things don't count. Who wants to take "Thou shalt not steal"?
Well,
Carol,
what
you
I
want to
love
try?
what the rabbis have to say about stealing. There's the notion of genevat da'at, the stealing of one's mind. It is giving one a false impression. And an example that's given is if you give someone an invitation, you extend an invitation to someone knowing that they cannot accept it, you're stealing from their knowledge. You're giving them a false impression. If you play with the scales, if you say to a friend, oh, here's a vat of wine that you open, knowing that it's already been sold and would be open, that's a form of stealing. Yeah.
I think your friend Dennis Prager says his favorite law in the Talmud is if you know you're not going to buy something, don't ever ask for the price.
Yeah, it's the Talmud, it's the storekeeper law that if you're not allowed to ask a storekeeper.
So Carol, you're saying that's a form of stealing? That's really interesting.
Yeah, giving false impression because you're stealing from one's knowledge.
David?
Yeah, I would agree with Carol. I mean, it did mean kidnap, I think, originally in the Talmud. And I would go further. When we gossip, we steal people's reputations. Everybody in this room has worked very hard to build a reputation, and someone can destroy it in just a moment or two with a word said improperly and the like. When we steal software, we are stealing. If you want a contemporary example, it's done all the times. Something like 40% of people leave a hotel room with something that belongs to the hotel. That's stealing.
My mother.
But people rationalize it. People rationalize it. They say, I'm paying for it anyway. Stealing from corporations is somehow okay because they're a corporation. And I think we are raising a generation who feels entitled to things that are not even thought of as stealing anymore. So amen to everything that Carol said. But I think we also have to teach our children that, you know what? There are websites at some major universities wherein the students give their software to one another illegally with the knowledge of the university. That is out and out stealing. These are kids at a top school, an Ivy League school. It's done regularly. Somehow it's not thought of as stealing. That's not a good thing for America. It's not a good thing for this commandment, and it's not a good thing for their character. So when we think of this commandment seriously, and we think that every word out of our mouth has the potential to actually steal something away from somebody or do something good, then this commandment to me can be the root of so much. We steal people's time.
Plagiarism.
When if we keep people waiting to meet with us on a regular basis, if your doctor keeps you waiting on a regular basis because he or she overbooks, they are stealing. The time is the one thing you have in your life that's limited and can never be returned. This is a very powerful commandment.
If you'll forgive me, you can be at a Shabbat table and somebody's going to go on something for 30 minutes. He's sort of boring you, and boredom is a form of
well,
stealing.
then you can use you can murder them because at some point it's.
And then you can go with their wife and commit adultery.
Without touching.
Commit adultery.
Mr. Hazony, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I think that that here again, it's really important to look at stealing and try to see if there's something a little bit more profound in that connection that the rabbis drew with kidnapping. Okay, because when they say, because I think you said originally in the Talmud, I like that expression. Originally in the Talmud it says it's about kidnapping, but originally in the Bible, it says you shall not steal. And I think that the implication is that there's a connection between the two of them. That there's something about stealing that is in some sense like kidnapping. You're taking away part of who they are. And it reflects a certain fundamental disrespect for their humanity. There's a great story in the Talmud about Mar Zutra the Pious. Mar Zutra the Pious goes to a town where there's like this yeshiva or something, and somebody steals his sack of silver coins. So they try to figure out who did it, which student did it, and then all of a sudden he sees one of them walking out of the bathroom. The guy washed his hands, and he wipes his hands on his friend's shirt. So Mar Zutra the Pious says, that's the thief. Because if he can relate that way to the people around him, if he treats them as inhuman, as functions of what he needs, just whatever he feels like doing, then he's not above stealing my silver purse. They bound him up, and he confessed. So I think that there's something about property that is very crucial to understand that it's very much a part of who we are. It's a part, psychologically, very much a part of who we are. When our house is broken into, we feel violated, right? We don't just feel that our stuff has been taken. We feel that we have been attacked personally, and I think that it's very insightful on the part of the rabbis and the Bible, that combination, to recognize what property really is about.
Okay, we're up to number 9.
Number 9.
You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. How is this different, Carol, than, don't lie or be honest?
Well, it is about lying, and it is about not lying. It is about being honest, but it's about more than being honest. It is about avoiding lashon hara. But I'm reminded of what it says in the Quran about witnessing. It's not Muslims are commanded not to withhold any witnessing, and if they've witnessed some transgression against someone else, it is their duty to bear witness. So here's the others. It's not, do not bear false witness, but rather bear witness to what you see. So if you see a wrong and then ignore it, that's considered a sin, that one has to bear witness in support of the person. Doing the right thing here in that case is making sure that that transgression is recognized.
Do you think that is a different approach from the Bibles, or it's just another way of the flip side of the same coin?
Is it a flip side? I don't know if it's the flip side. It's connected to it, right? It's about, well, what does it mean to witness? Right?
Well, I mean, there is something on the gentle rebuke, but that's not part of the Ten Commandments. What I find fascinating about this 9th one, it has a really, when the rabbis talk about this one, it's very legal. You're looking at a court of law.
That's right, and that's what I think
real
that's what
specific.
it refers
This
to.
is not about when I'm at home.
This has to do specifically with, I understand it, of courts of law and the importance of the courts system being intact. So let me ask a question. How many of you have more faith today in the court system than you did 30 years ago? Just raise your hand if you have more faith. How many of you have less faith today in the court system? Okay. When the judicial system has lost the respect of the population, a country is in trouble. I believe that this commandment goes right to the heart of the judicial system being seen as one that adjudicates in as close to a good way as it can. So when I see however many people are here, almost unanimously, no one raised their hand that they have more faith. Almost everyone raised their hand that in 30 years you have lost faith. That to me is a reflection of this commandment and the importance of the courts being respected in their country.
Because really, I mean, in the Torah, right, if outside of the court system, if your best friend gets married and, you're not crazy about his wife on the day, it's okay to lie, right? You're not obligated to say the truth, so there's some white lies that are endorsed in the Torah. But this puts an enormous importance. When you're in a court of law, there are no caveats. There's absolutely, it's unequivocal, the importance of speaking the truth to the extent of the consequences that are happening. But let's go outside now, David.
Yeah.
We'll go outside.
And when do you know? When is lying okay and when isn't it? When is a white lie okay and when is a white lie not?
I think that what's clear both in the rabbinic writings and in all these examples is that the commandment of integrity and of honesty is not about having every single word you say be 100% technically true at all times, but rather that you are substantively representing yourself truthfully. Okay, so there's a story, for example, of a rabbi who was he put out an ad that he wanted to sell something, and somebody shows up in his house, and he wants to inquire about the thing he's selling, but the rabbi's in the middle of saying his prayers. So he's silent, he can't answer, he's busy saying his prayers, and the person who wanted to buy it took this as a bargaining position. He took the rabbi's silence, so he raised his price, and still the rabbi doesn't say anything because he's busy praying. He raised it even further, And when the rabbi finally finished his prayers, he said, I'm going to sell it to you for the first price you offered, because that was the price that I internally agreed to. Okay, and the fact that you misunderstood my prayer as a bargaining position, I'm not going to take advantage of that. So the idea, so here you're talking about a case where honesty isn't about any words that were said, right? No court of law would have said that this rabbi was wrong for taking the higher price. But the idea is, are you representing yourself truthfully? Is your outside like your inside, the rabbi said.
Mm-hmm.
Very good.
That's nice.
We are now up to the 10th. You shall not covet, a whole bunch of stuff. And before we get into the 10th, there's something I read from a great Jewish thinker, and I just want to share it with you because it speaks to the holistic nature of the 10 Commandments as she sees it, sort of the progression from the first to the last. And it's Nechama Leibowitz, whose take on the 10 Commandments was a progression from the inner to the outer, and then a return back to the inner. So in the first 2 commandments, we talk about, the idea of belief and non-belief of idols, which is something very internal. And the idea being that really you start with the inside, and then we gradually move to action, which is the idea of not taking God's name in vain. So we start introducing the idea of action, and then we go right into the Sabbath, which is real action, right? And then finally we go in overdrive. Between 6 and 8, we go into ethics and real, the idea of behavior and so forth. And then we gradually come back to the inside. And not only do we come back to the inside, but we go back into an emotion. Because thou shalt not covet is the only one of the 10 Commandments that deals with an actual emotion. And emotion is the deepest thing we have, right? So there's a sort of a full circle that I find fascinating in these 10 Commandments, which leads us right to number 10, the emotion, the heart. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female slave, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, coveting. I'm going to start with Rabbi Woznica. Again, on the surface, it's not a slam dunk, because I could say, Steve Jobs coveted his neighbor's house and he wanted to be really successful. Next thing you know, I have a great iPad. So, when is coveting okay? It's not clear to me that coveting is always bad.
That's a great point, and I agree with you. And so for years, I didn't understand this commandment. First of all, how can you tell someone not to covet? If someone has something that you want and you passionately want it, how can you legislate emotions? I think we were talking about the 5th commandment is honor your father and your mother, not love. And the whole point is you can't command emotions. And then I looked at this commandment a little more carefully, and I've grown to love this commandment, if I'm allowed to say that, because of what it says. It doesn't just say, if the commandment were you shouldn't covet, you just say you shall not covet, period. It said you shall not murder, you shall not steal. Here it's very specific. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, your ox, ass, et cetera, anything that is your neighbor's. And I've come to believe that you're allowed to covet anything that you want as long as you can obtain it in a moral and legal way. None of these things can be obtained more. If your neighbor's wife, she's not available to you, or if you want to make it husband today, and we probably certainly should, he's not available to you. The house is not available to you. You're allowed to covet a house like your wife, a house like your neighbor's, a spouse like your neighbor's. This commandment is brilliant because it is specific. Coveting can lead to a lot of wonderful things. People can sometimes covet. I have a friend who is doing research in cardiology back east. And I said to him, why do you want to discover this particular area of cardiology? He said, I'd like to be remembered as the man who discovered X, Y, and Z to stop heart attacks. Part of his desire to do so is coveting. But his coveting will lead to a very decent and wonderful thing in life. The question isn't, do we covet? It's what do we covet? And this commandment is telling us, if we want to covet something that we can't get legally or morally, get away from it. If you're too close to your neighbor, this goes a little bit about what you were saying, Carol, a little too close to your house, if there's too much fire there, move away. Because ultimately, if we covet too much, we can end up violating every other commandment to get what we want. Work backwards. We can violate the 9th commandment. We'll lie in court or bear false witness. The 8th commandment, we'll steal. The 7th, we might commit adultery. And the 6th, God forbid, we might even murder. This is a brilliant, brilliant commandment because it says, I understand the human being, God is saying, has desires. Know what's legit, know what's not legit, and that's what makes you human.
Beautiful.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I appreciate the iteration of the commandment in the Quran, which is do not desire the things of your neighbors. They are just mere ornaments, but what I give you is everlasting. And so when I think of materialism and the coveting of things and gathering of things, right, and how empty it all is, and the commandment is a reminder of what these things are, and they're how meaningless, frankly, they are. And again, if you want to take the affirmative, it is a reminder to us to appreciate what it is we have, not to be complacent, because I do think that there's something about ambition and drive and wanting something out there, wanting what someone else has that might motivate us to be better. But I do think that the commandment is a reminder of wanting what it is we have.
You know, there's a story of someone who went to Lubavitcher Rebbe, and he was concerned that he was becoming too arrogant. He was losing his humility because he was coveting a lot of things. And he asked the Rebbe for a bracha so that he'd become more humble. And the Rebbe told him, why do you want a bracha to become more humble? If you think you can do more mitzvahs than your neighbor, just do the mitzvahs. Stop thinking about it. And stop thinking about whether you're arrogant or not, or whether you're humble or not. And just sort of focus on this thing that there's nothing wrong with you doing more mitzvahs than your neighbor. What is wrong is if you start talking about it and becoming a narcissist.
Yeah, I think that you're hitting on exactly the right point. I think that there's a difference, a difference between when we read "do not covet" all these things, we intuitively know what's going on in that commandment. That there is something wrong with a certain kind of coveting. There's something wrong with a certain attitude where you go through life and you look at what other people have and it hurts you that you don't have it yourself. As opposed to looking at other people who have things and saying, wow, he got that, maybe I can get that too. Right? You hear the difference in the psychological state between those two. And I think that there is here a legislation of emotion or of psychology in some sense, in the sense that it's saying, watch out for that first one. Watch out for jealousy. Watch out for turning things that you don't have and other people have into a basis of hatred. Watch out for that insecurity, that drives these kinds of emotions, because that's what leads to you doing bad things. So if your friend were just to say, I have ambition. I really want to do a lot and make a lot of money and be wealthy and then give it away and be remembered and all these things that are coming out of a placement of strength and of sort of a desire really to do good, that's one thing. Or even just to be wealthy, as long as it's not coming from a position of jealousy and anger and hurt, which is the basis of so much. Just one more little thing. War around the world. They always ask, in political science, they always like to ask, why is it that democracies don't go to war against each other? And to me, the answer is very simple. If you're in a political situation, a political system that lets you respond to bad things through self-criticism, because you're healthy enough that you can have a self-critical political environment, then people don't automatically look to external enemies to blame. Okay, but if you're in a political system in which everything is blamed on somebody else, everything you fail in, everything you don't do well in, turns into a cause of jealousy, then you end up starting wars. And democracies have a system that lets people be self-critical. So I think it's true on the personal level in exactly the same way. If you have a system that lets you be calm, self-critical sometimes, but also confident other times, and turning ambitious into productive activity, then you'll be peaceful. And if you don't, if everything is somebody else's fault, then that's going to be the cause of conflict.
How are we doing so far? You guys picking? All right.
I have
Wait,
I have a
comes.
question for David. Okay, because now,
for me?
yes, because you have.
We're all David.
So I
I've
want
never
to
committed
challenge
adultery.
you on something here. And actually, David Hazony as well, because on page 1 of his book, he mentions that the 10 Commandments are a blueprint for a good society. And you, David, started off, I think on more than one occasion, you mentioned, can they once again have meaning in our lives? And when do they ever really have meaning in our lives? What role have the 10 Commandments played in Jewish history? I mean, the rabbis certainly didn't want them to be prominent, and because that would in some way attenuate the entire halachic system. Right. So when were they really that prominent, and do we really want to go back to them? Are these the 10 Commandments that you would build a society on? Really, these are the 10 you would pick? Well, I mean, they're hugely problematic.
You know, I'll just share a little episode that happened with Hazony. Last year, he came to speak at an Orthodox synagogue, and I was there. And I thought he was brilliant, but it didn't go over that well because they sort of took it personally. Because he came in there and said, here's this critical text that was given by God through Moses. And somehow we, especially, in all denominations, we have sort of abandoned it. We've left it as a sort of an icon, an ornament. It's become an ornament. And it really made me think, why is that? And I think that's a good point, that maybe it was never really a sort of a meaningful component of Jewish life. But I think what I'm getting from David, from the book, is that it's an opportunity to take these, 10 windows, 10 doors, 10 ideas, 10 subjects, 10, great statements that could, become something that can transform your life depending on how you sort of approach them. And what I've seen tonight is a good example where what we were hoping to do tonight is give you a sort of a taste of how the 10 Commandments can be sort of 10 areas that we can really delve into below the surface. As a marketing guy, I can tell you there's a real branding issue. Had God, hired an ad agency, he would have had some real different ideas, because first of all, the word commandment is a big problem. It's not, we have already enough commandments in our life. The last thing we need is more rules. So right away, that's an issue. And then the other thing is, it feels like it's Cole's Notes. It's the Cliff Notes. So I'd rather read Lord of the Flies. I'm not going to read the Cliff Notes if I really want the real thing. So it's got the perception of being sort of a superficial summary. And it also has the disadvantage of being sort of a, thou shalt not. And they're written as commandments. So in fact, the reason we don't have 300 people tonight is because maybe they're called 10 Commandments. If it was 10 great ideas to improve your life, it might have been something different. So, just because we got 5-10 more minutes of our discussion. So I just want to throw that out in terms of why it hasn't been sort of the critical part of Jewish studies. But I think it can be. Rabbi?
The entire Western world, the Judeo-Christian world, has one of its epicenter, the 10 Commandments. And to my mind, it revolutionized humanity. The 10 Commandments were utterly revolutionary when they were, in my belief, received by the Jewish people. And to somehow say they never were never were central.
They were important. They're not the they're not the epicenter of the Old Testament.
No,
I
didn't
think
say
that's
that.
what.
The rabbis of the Talmud
what
did
David
not.
Hazony.
Well, hang on. They are the thing that Moses brought down from Mount Sinai. They were placed into they're called the tablets of the covenant. Nothing else is called that. They're placed into the Ark of the Covenant, which is then placed into the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle. And later, when the temple is built as the absolute focus of all ritual worship in Jerusalem, that Ark was placed into the Holy of Holies of that. Before the rabbis came along, it was the recitation of the Ten Commandments was in the center of the service. Now, you're right. Then Rabbinic Judaism, there was and has always been a certain stream,
and then Maimonides
that is very concerned about any hierarchy.
Right.
But
and also they became 613. I mean, in a way,
right.
That
That
became
if you
sort of the new number.
they say if you
And I actually think they're hugely important in terms of religious and cultural literacy. People need to know them. So I'm not attenuating their importance in terms of their being part of Western civilization and the at least two of the religious traditions. And clearly they were important. They were recited. We have evidence of them in Qumran and whatnot. So I don't mean to give the impression that they were never important, but I don't think that we should exaggerate their importance. And I think that in terms of an ethical foundation, they do limit us. When they were written, the worldview was very different from our worldview today. And they exclude the environment and they exclude our relationship to animals. Now, you know I'm from Brooklyn.
Actually, they don't exclude.
They don't exclude
The
animals
fourth
at all.
commandment about Shabbat
Right.
was the first commandment, I believe, in world history
You're right.
that said you couldn't work your animals to death. And in much of the world today, animals are worked to death because your animals had to rest on Shabbat as well. No code of 10 lines is going to encompass everything.
Right,
but I
if
want to
that's all they're
emphasize how
teaching-
no one
you're right.
suggested that to be all they're teaching.
Well-
But I'm simply saying it was revolutionary in its day. And as far as I know, many synagogues list the 10 commandments, and I do think become ornaments, which is not good. But often you'll see them on the Aron Kodesh, on the Ark.
But you'll
So
never
far-
see them. You will never see them written out in whole.
I agree with you, David.
No?
But there are at
Always
least,
as a
but you
symbol.
don't see, for example, the commandment, don't mix linen and wool up there.
Right.
You know, so the fact that the only commandments you seem to see are the 10 shows at least an ideological commitment to them, even though I completely and fully agree. I started off by saying I think if people took the 10 commandments seriously, it would change the way they live their lives. If you don't gossip, if you don't take God's name in vain, if you don't steal ideas, that is a revolutionary idea today. But its centrality, I think, has always been there in Judaism.
If I can just add, according to polls, 90% of Americans have a strong opinion as to whether or not the 10 Commandments should be put in front of a
Schools,
courthouse. But only 40% of Americans can name more than 4 of them.
Right.
Okay, so what really has happened is that they've really been transformed into a symbol
Yes, I agree.
And a political football.
and a political football.
So we're done with our section. Unless somebody wants to...
No.
Okay, Carol? You
No.
don't want to add on the adultery one? Okay.
Yeah, no.
Questions, speeches from the audience? Go ahead.
When I heard you talking about the first commandments and the last, the covet, the word that came to my mind consistently was appreciation. When Hashem took us out of bondage, the first command was to appreciate. And then as you go into your parents, no matter how much they are cruel or you can't love them, you appreciate what they did by creating life. And when you get to the last commandment, covet, the opposite of covet is appreciation. So if you want a house, you don't want his house, you don't want to lie in court, you don't want to do any of these things, you don't want to be an adulterer, you want to simply appreciate. And I think that, and the reason I say that also is a question I have, is how different is the meaning of the Hebrew words to the limitations of English?
The question was, the last part of it, I mean, was, I think, how does how much gets lost in translation? Is that your
Yes.
Well, I mean, I think that there are quite a few examples where things are getting lost in translation. I think it obviously depends on the translation, but the not murder versus not killing was one clear example.
Taking and
the question of taking the Lord's name in vain creates an ambiguity. Is it just about, what, as we said, is it trivial? Is it about the names we use, or is it about swearing false oaths? And I think that part of the problem, as we said, is that some of these translations in English aren't even direct translations from Hebrew. Hebrew is a very, very different language from English to begin with. It's a Semitic language. It's just the whole thing creates a very different kind of an aura. And if you go through two other languages, Greek and Latin, before you get to English, then you're playing telephone.
Before we go on to the next question, I want to do a little piece of business. And I want to thank some people. Thank Hillside Memorial Park for sponsoring this event. They have a great table outside. I want to thank Jewish Journal, Tribe Media, jewishjournal.com, Jay Firestone, Rachel Field, and Courtney Rainey. It'll be up on the website in a day or two if you want to share it with your family. And David Hazony's book is outside waiting for your money. And he's got lots of change, and I highly recommend the book. So we're going to do a few more questions. Monica?
One of the many fascinating things that I picked up on in all three of the panelists' Midrashic responses to the Decalogue is a kind of tension between intentionality on one hand and action on the other hand. And this is very, at least, surprising because Judaism is so much about action as opposed to intentionality. So I'm hoping that one of you or all three of you can speak just a little bit to how you see the Ten Commandments in this contemporary post-9/11 era negotiating this tension between intentionality and action.
I think it was, and I hope I'm quoting it correctly, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin, who put it very thoughtfully. We judge ourselves by our intentions and we judge others by their actions. The only people who can know one's intentions are the person who are doing the act. Judaism, at least from my understanding, very, very rarely asks what our intentions are. What it says is, are we doing good? Because sometimes our intentions may be all over the place. And often by doing good, our intentions become good. As I heard it once put, the deed shapes the heart far more than the heart shapes the deed. So let's do good. And in the meantime, I think it might have been Prager whose line that was. I want to give credit, but it doesn't matter. I think, Judy, I think you're perceptive. Your question's very perceptive. And I think that's what we have done in the modern world, in a world where we're always concerned with people's feelings and people's emotions and people's intentions. But that's a modern concern. I think Judaism, in its wonderful wisdom, understood that people's intentions can be all over the map. What ultimately counts in life is what we do. Many parents who abuse their children may have done so with very good intentions, but those children were abused.
But I'm sorry. Okay, but I think, though, on a deeper level, what I love about what I've studied on the Ten Commandments is that it does sort of deal with the interior, and especially the way Neshama Leibowitz discusses starting from the interior. It might not be exactly intention, and the idea of ending on the emotion, it almost says that action may be the most important thing, but ultimately we want to transform our inside.
I agree, and to her point, I
That's
thought was
the
very
goal.
thoughtful, but I would add to it that what transforms the inside is often the outside. Act in a good way, and you may transform yourself internally.
But what I have found, though, especially in the Orthodox world, is there's such a focus on the ritual. There's such a focus on the outside that somehow the inner part gets lost in the picture.
I think that this issue of actions and intentions, and I would add, there's a third part. There's intentions, there's actions, and there's consequences of your actions, which is also something that you need to bear in mind. And I think that what we're getting is a sense that all of these three areas are part of who you are. And when the teaching is a teaching about how to be a complete human being, it's saying we can't draw these sharp lines. Who you are is what you feel, who you are is what you do, and who you are is the responsibility you take for the things that are done because of these things. So I think that in some sense, the Hebrew Bible, just as it rejects the division between spirit and body, it also rejects the division between intentions, actions, and consequences.
Yes.
Oh, my understanding of this evening was that we were going to explore the Ten Commandments as they affect Jews and Americans in general, and I offered the references actually as in my intention, whether it was a good intention, was to provide information and share my knowledge with you. That was the only reason I brought it into the dialogue. So
And we're
forgive
glad
me
you
if you
did.
were offended.
Yeah, no, I think that I took it the same way that I took your references to Wordsworth, if I'm not mistaken. And frankly, I see both of those as vastly superior to having had any references to Charlie Sheen.
Yes, sir.
I would like to follow up on that, though, but I didn't hear you refer to Mein Kampf. I'm saying, yeah, you referred to Christianity, you referred to Wordsworth, but are you blind to the fact that this book that is followed by so many people is followed by people who, you quoted that when they see their idea of reporting false witness is in a sense sharpened. But these are like people like one of them just broke into a home and stabbed to death an infant. Every day we hear of suicide bombers.
Okay,
there seems to be no nuance on your part that what you're quoting seems to be observed in the breach much more than in the observance. And I'll tell you, I have a daughter that might soon go to UCLA. You seem like a very entertaining and really intelligent woman. I wonder if I want her in your class. I see no nuance.
I take umbrage at
Yeah,
what
no,
you're
my
saying.
daughter's
And
going
in
in her
fact,
class.
if there's
Yeah,
no
yeah.
nuance, it's in your reaction, sir. Because as I said, I offered these examples as an opportunity for us to see that the Ten Commandments have reverberations in Christianity and in Islam. And if I had more time, I would have also drawn on Jainism and Buddhism and what ethical systems they have. As
Next week
Hang on,
we're doing Buddhism next
Can I
week.
just
Yeah,
add,
but
can, wait,
you're-
can I,
you're
can I
now-
add
you're-
something
you're
here?
imputing
Hold
on a
Can I
religion.
Can I
Yeah.
just say something? Nobody is going to tell me, okay, I don't know about Carol. No one's going to accuse me of being the tiniest bit soft on terrorism, okay? And beyond that, I might be accused of making generalizations about Arab society, about what the broader causes of terrorism may be. But I've read the Quran, okay? There are things in it that are objectionable, and there are things in it that are beautiful. And I'm not convinced, I'm very, very far from convinced that that book is the reason why innocents are slaughtered in terrorist attacks.
What's quoting then? What's more important, the Quran or Muslims?
Hold on a second. Hold on. Well,
Move
this
on,
man's had his
because
hand
my-
up for
my
a while.
blood is
Go ahead.
boiling and-
Stand up and project.
It seems like in the last
Wow.
few years there's been like an epidemic of Jewish people being involved in desecration of the Ten Commandments. I don't want to mention names, but someone involved
One sitting in jail right now.
$50 billion, or a lobbyist in Washington, a rabbi in New York relating to people giving money for tax deductions and getting back their money. It just seems like in the last few years this has been publicized. Has it existed before, or is there some reason why it's happening now?
When the economy collapses, a lot of bad things come out that might not have come out otherwise. How's that for an answer? I don't know.
more noise. Does anybody have a question on the Ten Commandments? Go ahead.
I'd really like the panel, please, to address something that I didn't hear, and it may be that I missed it. I'm a very simple girl in a lot of ways. But it seems to me that the Ten Commandments are both internal and external. They're both societal and personal. I should not steal because God said I shouldn't steal, and I don't want to be the kind of person who would steal. And I want to live in a society where everybody else agrees with that. So it tells me how to function in a larger context as well as internally. Could we address that a little bit? Or is that just my take on this?
Well, David, I mean, you addressed that in your book, you know, on as a community and so forth. You want to take that?
Look, I think that one of the places where I depart from traditional Jewish interpretations is that I don't take the two tablets as one between being between man and God and one between man and man. I don't find patterns in the Ten Commandments for a very simple reason, which is that I was determined to have a fresh reading and to what people may sometimes call a naive reading. And it didn't jump out at me. On the contrary, I came to the same conclusion that you just described, that every single one of these commandments is both between man and God and between man and man. Every single one of these reflects something about who we are internally, about the impact we have on our society, and about our relationship with the divine. And I found these to be simply 10 different angles, 10 different statements. But maybe other people disagree.
No, there's nothing to disagree with. I mean, I think Judaism is all about character and elevating character. And the way we elevate character is both by what we do on the outside and what we do on the inside. We were speaking before, though. What we didn't share was the words which precede the Ten Commandments, which are, God spoke all these words saying. In other words, it's God who wants us to do these things. We ultimately answer, as the old Hebrew National commercial said, to a higher authority. So we do answer to ourselves, but ultimately we answer to God, which I think elevates a human. You can believe in God and be a despicable human being, and you can be an atheist and you can be a saint. So let's take that off the table. No argument that belief in God ensures morality. But for a society not to feel that it answers to something higher, it was God who gave us these values, God who gave us these ideals, and ultimately, I think that's how we ultimately change ourselves. So I completely agree. It's exterior and internal character that ultimately becomes changed.
And if I may, I'd like to wrap up the evening with an addition to character. And in my view, I think one of the biggest missed opportunities in religion generally is creativity. Whereas there's nothing in the Torah, there's nothing in the Talmud that says you are not allowed to be creative with how you interpret the commandments. You're not allowed to be imaginative with how you view these commandments. There's nothing in the Torah that says you're not allowed to find your own personal meaning in the commandments. And there's nothing that says you can't sort of explore and challenge. And what I love about tonight's evening and your book, David, is that these are sort of 10 invitations for all of you and all of us to sort of find our personal meaning in Judaism so that ultimately it's not just God's, but we own it as well. Thank you very much.